Warning, this video contains opinions, ones that you might not agree with, and that's okay. Just know that this is my opinion that I've developed over a 2-month period of writing this video. When it comes to Battlefield 2042, I don't think there is a feature that has come under more scrutiny or is more controversial than the Specialist system, and seeing as DICE have announced that in the next month or two they will be formatting Specialist into something that resembles the traditional Battlefield class system, they might agree with that. But like most changes that DICE have made to the game, including their continued map overhauls, the changes to the core game seem to be halfway changes that try to meet in the middle. With the Specialist system, as we know it, permanently changing soon, I wanted to do a deep dive on Specialists for this video today to try and analyze how they impact the game and see if there is any way that this system could have been a resounding success. This is a video that, as I said, I have been writing for a while now because I find it to be a somewhat complicated issue. The first thing I wanted to note on the topic before we begin, and something that we should keep in mind during this video, is that Specialists as a mechanic were never designed for a Battlefield game as we know it. According to reports made by Tom Henderson and other prominent journalists, Battlefield 2042 was going to be a battle royale in an attempt by EA executives to cater to the wider FPS market, before changing back to a more traditional Battlefield shooter midway through the development cycle, and that battle royale mode turned into Hazard Zone, which for the most part was a dead-on arrival game mode. So Specialists in a way were square pegs trying to be shoved into circular holes, and this is something that you can see a lot of in the initial design decisions littered across Battlefield 2042. Many things felt half-assed and incomplete, likely because they were, and that does not exclude Specialists, who for the majority of the game's lifecycle have not only felt disjointed from the world of 2042, but also seem to clash with Battlefield's core mechanics despite trying to emulate them. With this in mind, was there ever a reality in which Specialists actually could work well in a Battlefield game, or were Specialists as a mechanic doomed to fail from the very beginning?
And so when the fog lifted, we spotted your beached boat and decided to investigate. But who is that?
This is the end of the mystery.
Well, well, if it isn't our old friend Bluestone the Great, an ex-magician that's wanted in 6 states.
For those who may be new to this channel, a lot of my Battlefield 2042 catalog of videos are dedicated to guides on how to play Battlefield, and more specifically for 2042, how to play Specialists, as they are very important to the gameplay loop of the game. In doing so, I've spent a lot of time playing every Specialist to understand how they work, or I suppose I should say how they are intended to work, because the intended effect and the actual effect of these Specialists are very different. In making Battlefield 2042, it was reported that EA DICE wanted to try and replicate mechanics from other popular games at the time, including Apex Legends, Call of Duty, and Overwatch, and you can see the influence of those games in the Specialist system. And while some inspirations were taken and designed well into the game, the main negative point that I'm going to keep circling back to is this: it doesn't matter how well that the Specialists were designed, hero shooter elements simply do not work in a traditional Battlefield game, and here are a few reasons why. For each point here, I am going to compare Battlefield to the 3 games mentioned above, in which DICE pulled inspiration from, and talk about why Battlefield does not work as well with these inspired mechanics. I should say that when I'm talking about Call of Duty, because there are so many of them, I'm talking more specifically about Black Ops 4 and Warzone, as Black Ops was the game currently out when 2042 began its development in late 2018. First, let's talk about the idea of counters, which in a hero shooter is the idea that every character in a game has an alternate character that directly counters what they're good at. So to take an example from Overwatch, Pharah is a character that flies around the objective and shoots rockets down at your team. So in order to counter her effectively, you would want to choose a character like Soldier 76, which has a full auto assault rifle and is a hit scan character and is effective at taking down those kinds of targets. So ideally, when you have a game with hero-like abilities, you want to have characters that counter each other, and while Battlefield 2042 will not directly identify itself as a hero shooter, it was clearly heavily influenced by a couple, and while DICE were clearly fine with the idea of having hero-like abilities and characters, they weren't so thrilled with having plausible counters for all of them. Hold on to this idea, we'll be coming back to it frequently. See, Battlefield 2042 is an arcade sandbox shooter masquerading around as a team hero shooter, while also having a majority of the abilities in the game be inconsequential for the benefit of the team. There are some specialists like Falk, Irish, Casper, and Angel that do have abilities that benefit the team, but when you peel back the curtain a little bit, it's because that behind the shiny new coat of paint, these are the traditional Battlefield classes. It's safe to say that these specialists are ones that players don't have complaints about, really, because they are the ones that we know the best through years and years and years of playtime. The only exception being Irish, which, to DICE's credit, is unique and designed to Battlefield 2042, but beyond that, the other 9 specialists in the game currently feel like DICE threw darts on the ability board, and they exist in this weird middle ground of helping the player and the team at the same time. When writing this video, I struggled with how one would even classify the specialist abilities in Battlefield 2042, since they take from so many different video games. It's similar to Overwatch in that each character has 2 main abilities, but dissimilar because there are no ultimate abilities in Battlefield 2042. In fact, that's actually something that Battlefield is completely unique in comparison to all the other games that we'll be comparing it to today, as every game that we'll be comparing it to has an ultimate ability. Instead, 2042 opted for abilities that operate on a cooldown cycle, which has its own pros and cons. Out of all 3 games, Battlefield actually has the most similarities with Black Ops 4, where characters have a unique equipment ability, a gadget, and then the ultimate ability. And when you look even deeper, the similarities can sometimes be a little too similar. You had your grapple hooking specialist, your wall hack specialist, your shield specialist, and I'm gonna cut it off there, you get the idea. That aside, the main difference is that unlike Black Ops 4, Battlefield 2042 has no ultimate ability, as we've discussed. So why do specialists work in games like Apex and Black Ops but not so much in Battlefield? Well, there are 2 main reasons. The first being that Apex and Call of Duty are fairly one-dimensional shooters. It's player versus player with some variables in gameplay due to those abilities. In Battlefield, vehicles add an entire other dimension to consider, and with there being air vehicles and ground vehicles, not to mention multiple variations of each kind of those vehicles, specialist mechanics have to take on another level of balancing, and whereas it's a bit more black and white to balance infantry versus infantry gameplay, vehicles being an independent variable complicate the idea of abilities that somewhat counter each other. And when we go back to the idea of counters, you find that they simply do not exist in Battlefield 2042, except in extremely one-sided circumstances. I'm sure the one character that has popped into your mind when talking about direct counters is Rao, who is the quintessential character when it comes to directly countering vehicles. Rao is a character that you would consider to be more of an Overwatch type of character. He has a direct purpose, and his kit is designed around that purpose, much like a healer has a bunch of healing abilities. The problem is that there is no counter to Rao from a vehicle player's perspective. The counter simply is just deal with it. The just deal with it ideology is something that is littered across the design of Battlefield 2042 Specialist. It's not that counters do not exist in the gameplay, it's just that they are not consistent and they certainly are not thought out. See, there are so many situations in Battlefield 2042 where you are on the receiving end of some particular specialist abilities and you feel completely helpless, and the frequent answer as to what you can do about it is just deal with it. There is no counter to Sundance flying behind you and scatter grenading you. There is no counter to Crawford ambushing you with a minigun. There is no counter to Zane firing airbursts at you while you were behind the very little cover that already exists on the maps, and many more situations where you just have to deal with it or play a specific character, in this case Irish, to which if we drop an Uno reverse card and we say, what is the main counter to Irish's Sentinel system? The answer is, once again, say it with me, just deal with it. Sure, you can destroy the Sentinel, but countering abilities is not the main aspect of a Battlefield game. It's capturing objectives and killing enemy players. It's not like Overwatch, again for example, where you would need to shoot Baptiste's invincibility shield in order to win the team fight. No, in Battlefield, it's just kill more than you die and be on the objective while doing so, and if specialist abilities are involved while doing so, just deal with it. And that's just one player playing Irish, and since these abilities can operate on a quick cooldown, some specialist abilities can be used almost as instantly as you destroy them. Because DICE have opted to make it to where abilities operate on a constant cooldown as opposed to an ability that you have to earn over time, the ability spam, depending on the player's ability mind you, can be nearly constant, especially in Breakthrough, which in my opinion is the most popular game mode. Which leads me to my main point here, and is the take home for this section, is that not only are the maps too big to properly regulate the flow and use of these abilities, the player count of Battlefield games are way too high for specialists with hero-like abilities, and I mean way too big. And for those of you that may say that traditional Battlefield classes could be considered as hero specialists considering that they had unique abilities, the medic had the med pouch, the recon always had the recon drone, and so on and so forth, and you'd be right about that. They are almost like hero-like specialists, and they presented balancing problems before. You just never really noticed it. Think I'm wrong? How many games of Battlefield have you lost purely because the other team had more medics than your own? Or how many games have you won because your team out-revived the other team? How many games have you lost because there were too many scout players on the team? It would be different if Battlefield was a 6v6 shooter, which is the case for nearly every other shooter that we're comparing it to. Call of Duty specialists worked because they were in a small, controlled 6v6 environment. Apex Legends works despite its player count because it's a battle royale and the player pool continuously shrinks to where abilities become more important than just who landed on better weapons first. Overwatch, which was formerly a 6v6 game, is now a 5v5 game because it got too chaotic and ult spammy at times. So how in the living hell did DICE think that Battlefield 2042 would succeed in having specialists with advanced abilities that operated on a cooldown with a player count of 120 players, which was now doubled what the player count used to be for a Battlefield game? When you say it out loud like that, you really begin to grasp how much of an uphill battle balancing this game can be, or probably was. Because it doesn't matter what the base stats are for a specialist when there can be a random, unpredictable number of this specialist every match. The developers have to operate on blind faith that the distribution of specialists will be good enough to balance the game and make it enjoyable. And when the game balances off, this game just is not that fun. But there is nothing to be done about it because one bad tweak can send a specialist over the edge. That's why you get metas like the Boris turret meta, the Angel everyone has armor meta, the Pake wallhack meta, or the Sundance scatter grenade spam meta, and every time a new meta arises, it comes around suddenly because people discover how powerful some of these specialist mechanics are in numbers. Every specialist has had their moment. Well, all except one. And the sad thing is that these specialists can never really shine because the net result of them all is just more spam. If they were truly thought out and carefully designed instead of thrown together, the gameplay of Battlefield 2042 really could have been something unique, but now it's a cycle of the community hopping from one specialist to another, forcing the developers to nerf them into the ground to where they have very little impact. See Boris or Angel. On top of that, for what these specialists lack, it's made up for in the fact that every specialist can have any weapon, and with a few exceptions, any gadget, which only adds to the game's unpredictability. That's why people get so confused during my specialist rankings videos when I rank all these specialists so low on the list, because by themselves, their abilities are not great, but with many of them, they become super oppressive and strong. Liz's kit, for example, when you get down to the nitty-gritty, it's not strong by herself, but when there are 5 to 6 dedicated Liz players spamming rockets at vehicles, that is horrifically unbalanced, and that doesn't even begin to account for the other 3 to 6 Rao players that may be in the game that are hacking these vehicles constantly, so that a random number of players on the team that happen to be running a rocket launcher can kill those vehicles too. I think my point at this point is becoming redundant, so I'll move on. But what if there was a way that specialists could have worked in a Battlefield game? This is where I find the video to be a little bit complicated, because I think that it's fairly easy to grasp as to why specialists don't work as well as you'd hope in Battlefield 2042, but if they were to exist at all, is there a better alternative? Since Battlefield 2142 all the way back in 2006, Battlefield has had a mechanic that has gone by a couple of names, but you would likely know the most by the title of Field Upgrade System, which either gave or allowed players to passively earn perks while they played. In Battlefield 3, each player in your squad could equip a different specialization and have it apply to the entire squad, while in Battlefield 4, specializations were made more into a progression tree that you had to progress through each game by performing actions on the battlefield. Originally, I thought that DICE simply just couldn't see the potential of these specializations in 2042 and missed out on an opportunity that was right under their noses, but when I looked closer, you find that some specialists do have some of these classic specializations in their kits. Just like most things in Battlefield 2042, it's only done halfway. Specialists like Dozer have the Blast Resistance passive, which offers damage reduction against explosive, just like the flak perk that was in countless games before 2042. There is an armor field upgrade in Battlefield 4 that essentially does what armor does for Irish in Battlefield 2042. In Battlefield Hardline, there was a tier 1 operator perk that gave you faster climbing on ropes like McKay's nimble passive trait, and allowed reviving to 100% like Falk's field surgeon passive trait. There are so many of these perks, field upgrades, specializations, whatever you want to call them, that have been in Battlefield games for over 15 years, and many of them, if employed correctly, could be implemented quite nicely into specialist kits in 2042, and dare I say, you might even be able to make more specialists from the amount of them that are available. Perks like the Slink trait from Battlefield 1, which quiets your footsteps, or some of the spotting traits from Battlefield 3 and 4, where you spot for longer or get spotted for less time. That could be useful, I imagine, in a game like 2042 where you're spotted constantly. Why not? Instead of giving all of these specialists in 2042 abilities that can be spammable and uncounterable, give them multiple passive abilities that still make them unique while bringing Battlefield back to the basic pillars: infantry versus land vehicles versus air vehicles. You could even go as far as implementing specialists that are for vehicle players only, giving them better repairing or threat detection, since DICE already went more than a year without giving tanks proper APS systems. It all sounds plausible in theory, but let me pose this question to you. Is that too boring? See, there is one side of me that thinks, well, these abilities were in Battlefield games before, and they were kind of an afterthought, but then again, there is this calling for a more traditional Battlefield class system, and enough of a calling that we'll be getting that changed in the next month or so, so maybe this would be welcomed. But the other side of me thinks that these specialists may be oppressive at times, but without their grapple hooks, syringe pistols, wingsuits, miniguns, would they lack appeal? And more importantly, would they lack fun to where it detriments the gameplay? And not to mention, there are some passive like Sundance's wingsuit that operate more like a main ability, to be frank, and I would imagine would either have to be taken out of the game or reworked. So while I think focusing on passive traits might have been the better alternative for the game overall, what if there was another way? What if these specialists kept their abilities, but instead of operating on a constant cooldown system, DICE adhere more to the hero shooter genre and make the main abilities an ultimate ability? That's similar to games like Overwatch and Destiny. You earn faster based on your performance on the battlefield. It's a concept that we've already briefly touched on with the way DICE did specializations in Battlefield 4. That way, abilities can't just be spammed, and it will put greater emphasis on performing well outside of the abilities and enhancing team play, even more so creating a higher skill gap in using the abilities effectively and correctly. So take Falk for example. She would keep her passive of reviving players quicker and to full health, but the more that Falk player dives into the medic role, getting revives and other team play interactions, she will gain more charge to unlock her Surret pistol as an ultimate ability, which will allow her to heal others from farther away as she does already. And if that's not strong enough, maybe as an ultimate ability you bring back the ability all the way from the alpha to have the Surret pistol revive people as well. There would have to be some serious rebalancing either way, but if you aren't a fan of just having passive traits, is this an alternative that you would be okay with? In the end, I think the main takeaway is this: Battlefield 2042 is too large of a game to properly implement hero shooter elements the way they traditionally are designed, and the way that DICE has tried to sandwich all these mechanics into a large-scale military shooter just doesn't work. But in a world in which Battlefield 2042 was designed for 64 players, there are options or alternatives that could have made Specialist a success. If the game perhaps was not designed to be a large battle royale during the first year of development, maybe the Specialist would have been designed differently. Maybe they wouldn't exist at all. But in the case of 2042, maybe they were doomed to fail from the very beginning. That's the end of the video, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm curious to know your thoughts on the topic. If you liked the video, please leave a like and a comment, as it greatly helps me in the algorithm. And if you like the video just that much, you should consider subscribing for more content. This is the last video before the new year. I'll be back in January, so Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, and Happy New Year to all of you out there. Once again, thank you all for watching. My name is Catalyst, and I will see you all another time.